नमस्कार। आज के हमारे लेक्चर का विषय है बायोस्फीयर पार्ट 4 एनवायरमेंटल कंडीशन। मोस्ट ऑर्गेनिजम्स आर लिमिटेड to either a terrestrial or an aquatic environment. An organism's ability to tolerate local condition within its environment further restricts its distribution. One parameter such as temperature tolerance may be important in determining the limits of distribution, but often a combination of variables such as temperature tolerance and water requirements is important. Extreme environmental variables can evoke physiological and behavioral responses from organisms. The physiological responses helps the organisms maintain a constant internal environment homeostasis, while a behavioral response allow to it to avoid the environmental challenges, a fallback strategy if homeostasis cannot be maintained. The way in which modern living organisms tolerate environmental conditions reflects the aquatic organisms of life. With few exceptions, life cannot exist outside the temperature range at which water is a liquid. Thus, liquid water and temperatures that maintain water as a liquid are essential for sustaining life. Within those parameters, the concentrations of dissolved salts and other ions, the abundance of respiratory gases, atmospheric or hydrospheric pressures, and rate of water flow all influence the physiology, behavior, and distributions of organisms. Temperature has the single most important influence on the distribution of organism because it determines the physical state of water. Most organisms cannot live in condition in which the temperature remains below 0 degree or above 45 degrees centigrade for any length of time. Adaptations have enabled certain species to survive outside this range. Thermophilic bacteria have been found in hot springs in which the temperatures may approach the boiling point, and certain polar mosses and lichens can tolerate temperatures at of minus 70 degree, but these species are the exceptions. Few organisms can remain for long periods at temperature above 45 degrees centigrade because organic molecules such as protein will begin to denature. Nor are temperature below freezing conducive to life. Cells will rupture if the water they contain freezes. Most organisms are not able to maintain a body temperature that is significantly different from that of the environment. Sessile organisms such as plants and fungi and very small organisms and animals that cannot move great distance therefore must be able to withstand the large range of temperature sustained by their habitat. In contrast, many mobile animals employ behavioral mechanisms to avoid extreme conditions in the short term. Such behaviors vary from simply moving short distance out of the sun or an icy wind to large scale migration. Some types of animals employ physiological mechanisms to maintain a constant body temperature, and two categories are commonly distinguished. The cold-blooded is understood to refer to reptiles and invertebrates, and warm-blooded is generally applied to mammals and birds. These terms, however, are emphasized the more accurate terms ectotherm for cold-blooded and endotherm for warm-blooded are more useful in describing the thermal capabilities of these animals. Ectotherms rely on external sources of heat to regulate their body temperatures, and endotherms thermoregulate by generating heat internally. Terrestrial ectotherms utilize the complex temperature profile of the terrestrial environment to drive warmth. They can absorb solar radiation, thus raising their body temperature above that of the surrounding air and substrate. Unlike the aquatic ectotherm, though whose body temperature is generally very close to that of the environment, as the solar radiation is take up physiological mechanism contribute to the regulation of heat. Peripheral blood vessels dilate and heart rate increases. The animal also may employ behavioral mechanisms such as reorienting itself towards the sun or flattening its body and spreading its leg to maximize its surface area exposure. At night, loss of heat may be reduced by other behavioral or physiological mechanisms. The heart rate may slow, peripheral blood vessels may constrict, surface area may be minimized, and shelter may be sought. This is the energy exchange between a terrestrial reptile and the environment. Endotherms maintain body temperature independently of the environment by the metabolic production of heat. They generate heat internally and control passive heat loss by varying the quality of their insulation or by repositioning themselves to alter their effective surface area, that is curling into a tight ball. If heat loss exceeds heat generation, metabolism increases to make up the loss. If heat generation exceeds the rate of loss, mechanisms to increase heat loss by evaporation occur. In either case, behavioral mechanism can be employed to seek a more suitable thermal environment. To survive for a limited period in adverse conditions, endotherms may employ a combination of behavioral and physiological mechanism in cold weather, which requires an increase in energy consumption. The animal may either enter a state of torpor in which its body temperature, metabolism, respiratory rate, and heart rate are depressed. Long-term winter hypothermia or hibernation is an extended state of torpor that some animals use as a response to cold conditions. Torpor and hibernation free the animals from energetically expensive maintenance of high body temperature, saving energy when food is limited. Another form of torpor estivation is experienced by animals in response to heat stress. This state is seen more often in ectotherm animals than in endotherm, but in both the stimulus for estivation is usually a combination of high temperatures and water shortage. Humidity. Most terrestrial organisms must maintain their water content within fairly narrow limits. Water commonly is lost to the air through evaporation or in plants transpiration. Because most water loss occurs by diffusion and the rate of diffusion is determined by the gradient across the diffusion barrier, such as the surface of a leaf or skin. The rate of water loss will depend on the relative humidity of the air. Relative humidity is the percent saturation of air relative to its total saturation possible at a given temperature. When air is totally saturated, relative humidity is said to be 100%. Cool air that is completely saturated contains less water vapor than completely saturated warm air. Because the water vapor capacity of warm air is greater, diffusion gradient across skin or leaf therefore can be much steeper in summer when the air is warm, rendering evaporative water loss a much more serious problem in warm environment than in cool environment. Nevertheless, rates of water loss are higher in dry air than in most moist air, regardless of the temperature. Water loss from evaporation must be compensated by water uptake from the environment. Most plants' transpiration water loss is countered by the uptake of water from the soil via roots. For animals, water content can be replenished by eating or drinking or by the uptake through the integument. For organisms living in dry environment, there are many morphological and physiological mechanisms that reduce water loss. Desert plants or xerophytes typically have reduced leaf surface area because leaves are the major sites of transpiration. Some xerophytes shed their leaves altogether in summer and some are dormant during the dry season. Desert animals typically have skin that is relatively impervious to water. The major site of evaporation is the respiratory exchange surface. Such must be moist to allow the gaseous exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide. A reduction in amount of water lost through respiration can occur in the temperature of the exhaled air is lower than the temperature of the body. As many animals such as gazelles inhale warm air, heat and water vapor from the nasal passages evaporates, cooling the nose and the blood within it. The cool venous blood passes close to and cools the warm arterial blood traveling in the brain. If the brain does not require cooling, the venous blood returns to the heart by another route. The nasal passages also cool the warm, saturated air from the lungs so that water condenses in the nose and is reabsorbed rather than lost to the environment. pH. The relative acidity or alkalinity of a solution is reported by the pH scale, which is a measure of the concentration of hydrogen ion in solution. Neutral solutions have a pH of 7. A pH of less than 7 denotes acidity and above 7 alkalinity. Many important molecular processes within the cells of the organisms occurs with a very narrow range of pH. Thus, maintenance of internal pH by homeostasis mechanism is vital for cells to function properly. Although pH may differ locally within an organism, most tissues are within 1 pH unit of neutral. Because aquatic organisms generally have somewhat permeable skin or respiratory exchange surface, external conditions can influence internal pH. These organisms may accomplish the extremely important task of regulating internal pH by exchanging hydrogen ion for the ions such as sodium and bicarbonate with the environment. The pH of naturally occurring waters can range from very acidic condition of about 3 in peat swamps to very alkaline condition of about 9 in alkaline lakes. Naturally acidic water may result from the presence of organic acid, as is the case in a peat swamp, or from geologic conditions such as sulfur deposits associated with volcanic activity. Naturally occurring alkaline water usually result from inorganic sources. Most organisms are unable to live in conditions of extreme alkalinity or acidity. Salinity. The term salinity refers to the amount of dissolved salts that are present in water. Sodium and chloride are the predominant ions in water, and the concentration of magnesium, calcium, and sulfates ions are also substantial. Naturally occurring waters vary in salinity from the almost pure waters devoid of salts in snow white to the saturated solution in salt lakes such as the Dead Sea. Salinity in the ocean is constant but is more variable along the coast where seawater is diluted from freshwater, from runoff, or from the emptying of river. The brackish water form a barrier separating marine and freshwater organisms. The cells of organisms also contain solutions of dissolved iron, but the range of salinity that occurs in tissue is more narrow than the range that occurs in nature. Although a minimum number of ions must be present in the cytoplasm for the cells to function properly. Excessive concentrations of iron will impair cellular functioning. Organisms that live in aquatic environment and whose integument is impermeable to water therefore must be able to contend with osmotic pressure. This pressure arises if two solutions of unequal solute concentration exist on either side of a semi-permeable membrane such as the skin. Water from the solution with a lower solute concentration the will cross the membrane, diluting the more highly concentrated solution until both concentrations are equalized. If the salt concentration of an animal's body fluid is higher than that of the surrounding environment, the osmotic pressure will cause water to diffuse through the skin until the concentrations are equal, unless some mechanism prevent this from happening. Many marine invertebrates have the some osmotic pressures as seawater. When the salt concentrations of their surrounding changes, however, they must be able to adjust. Two means of contending with this situation are employed, and depending on how they regulate the salt concentration of their tissue, organisms are classified as regulators or osmoconformers. The osmotic concentrations of the body fluid of an osmoconformer changes to match that of its external environment, whereas osmoregulator controls the osmotic concentration of its body fluids, keeping them constant in spite of external alternation. Aquatic organisms that can tolerate a wide range of external ion concentrations are called euryhaline. Those that have a limited tolerance are called stenohaline. Even if aquatic organisms have an integument that is relatively impermeable to water, as well as to small inorganic ions, the respiratory exchange surface are permeable. Hence, organisms occurring in water that has a lower solute concentrations than their tissues will constantly lose ions to the environment as water flow into their tissue. In contrast, organisms in salty environment face a constant loss of water and an influx of ions. Many mechanisms have evolved that deal with these problems. Because water cannot be readily pumped across cell membranes, salinity balance is usually maintained by actively transporting ions, usually sodium and chloride. This process consumes energy and can serve a large proportion of the energy budget of the animal in very saline environment. In marine fish, gill cells pump ions out of the body into the sea, while in freshwater fish, Gill cells pump ions in the opposite direction. Passive water loss in the marine fish is compensated primarily in one of two ways. Most bony fish drink capacively and excessive salt across the gills, while the majority of sharks artificially elevate the salt concentration of their tissue above that of seawater with urea and other organic molecules, allowing water to slowly and passively enter the body through their food and across their gills. Freshwater fish replenish most of the ions they lost. They also produce large quantities of very dilute urine to excrete excess water through that diffuses into their bodies. This is the diagram of osmotic regulation freshwater and marine water teleost fish. Water currents. The flow of water presents special problems for aquatic organisms. Flow is associated with river oceanic currents and waves and can be laminar, streamlined, or turbulent. Many organisms are specialized to live in flowing environments. The main obstacle to this lifestyle is the constant threat of being washed away. Both plants and animals have evolved mechanisms that helps to anchor them to the substratum and flowing water. For example, the hold fast of scalp of the biases threads of muscles. It encroach can be assured. There are many advantages of life in this environment. Flowing water generally is well oxygenated and the supply is continuous. Nutrients and foods are constantly replenished as well. The very precariousness of the environment also afford some protection from predation, because the number of predators that make this type of habit home is limited. Pressure, atmospheric pressure. Various in atmospheric pressure can present special problem for the respiratory systems of animals, because atmospheric pressures affect the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide that occurs during animal respiration. Normal atmosphere pressure at sea level is the total pressure that a column of air above the surface of the earth exerts. The total pressure is the sum of the pressures that each gas, mainly nitrogen, oxygen, and carbon dioxide, would exert alone. As an animal's breath, oxygen moves from the environment across their respiratory surface into the blood. Carbon dioxide moves in the reverse direction. This process occurs primarily by passive diffusion. Each gas moves from an area of greater to lesser partial pressure driven by the differential that exists across the respiratory surface. At higher altitudes where the atmospheric pressure is lower, the partial pressure of oxygen is also lower. The partial pressure differential of oxygen therefore is also lower, and the organism effectively receives less oxygen when it breathes. Even though the percentage of the oxygen in the air remains constant, this lack of oxygen is why humans carry oxygen when ascending to high altitudes. So humans who live in mountainous regions, however, can become acclimatized to the lowered availability of the oxygen, and certain animals such as lemurs have adaptation of the blood that allow them to live at high altitudes. Birds have very efficient lungs, and many apparently have no problems flying to high altitudes even for extended flights. Hydrostatic pressure. Because air and water have vastly different densities, the pressure experienced in terrestrial and aquatic habitats differ markedly. A column of water so much denser than air exert a greater amount of pressure than a column of air which with each 10-meter increase in depth there is an increase in hydrostatic pressure equivalent to 1 atmosphere. Mean ocean depth is about 3,800 meters and has a pressure of about 380 atmosphere. To surmount this environment challenges animals that live at great depths lack air compartments such as lungs or swim bladders. Surface dwelling animals that live at great depth meet this challenge differently. As pressure increases during a live, air compartment compresses, returning to their former volume when the animal surfaces. Air is forced into the trachea, bronchi, and bronchioles, where no gas uptake occurs. Thus, the increased pressures cannot drive more gases into the bloodstream, and as the thermal rises, it does not experiences the band decompression sickness resulting from a rapid reduction of air pressure. In contrast, sea snakes avoid the band by exerting nitrogen across the skin to offset the uptake of the gas from the lungs. Thanks.